بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. In the last lesson we started a number of statements by at-Tahaawee rahimahullah, and they were the saying of at-Tahaawee خلق الخلق بعلمه, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He created the creation with His knowledge, بعلمه. And likewise وقدر لهم أقدارا, that Allah decreed for them the decrees. And so in relation to these statements, just as a recap, we mentioned how with respect to the first statement, that Allah created the creation with His knowledge, خلق الخلق بعلمه, we mentioned a number of issues here, and from them was the issue that we differ with the Mu'tazila. So at-Tahaawee here, his statement is taken as a refutation of the Mu'tazila, because the Mu'tazila do not affirm any attributes for Allah's essence. And so they distinguish between Allah and His attributes, and then they take a number of approaches. So either they say that Allah's attributes, like Allah's hearing and seeing and knowledge, they are the same thing as His essence. His attributes are His essence. There are no independent attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or they say that Allah's attributes are other than Him, other than His essence. So in other words, Allah's knowledge, Allah's mercy, that this isn't something established with Allah as an attribute, rather it is merely just something which is found in the creation. So the mercy that is manifest in the creation, the knowledge that is known in the creation, and so on and so forth, that this is what is Allah's, this is said to be Allah's attributes, even though it is something created. And so Allah's attributes are things which are found in other than Him. And this, as we know, is batil, is false, is incorrect. And so anyway, when at-Tahaawee says خَلَقَ الْخَلْقَ بِعِلْمِهِ, that He created the creation with His knowledge, this is what Ahlul Sunnah say. They say Allah with His knowledge, Allah with His mercy, Allah with His power. Whereas the Mu'tazila, what they say is Allah and His mercy. They use the particle wa. Allah wa ilmuhu, Allah wa qudratuhu, Allah. And so they distinguish. And the reason why they say that is because obviously they have this position that attributes cannot be established with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we also spoke generally about Allah's knowledge, Allah's complete and perfect knowledge, how Allah's knowledge precedes everything, how Allah's knowledge does not have any beginning, just like Allah Himself is al-awwal, and likewise His attributes follow that as well. And so this was the first issue that we looked at. And then we began looking at the next statement, وَقَدَّرَ لَهُمْ أَقْدَارًا, that Allah decreed for them their decrees. He determined for them the decrees, the qadr, the aqdar, the decrees. And so with respect to that statement, we started discussing that statement, and we established that that under this statement that at-Tahaawee has made, there are three issues that come under it. There are three issues. The first issue that comes under this taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Allah determined all of the ways and means by which His creation comes to be. Right? And the best example to illustrate what is meant here is that how is a human produced? How does a human come to be? Allah determined for that outcome certain stages, such as, for example, the mixing of the male and female fluid, and then the lodging in the womb, and then the various stages that the embryo goes through up until you have a complete and perfect human being. right? So Allah determined these various ways and means and all these detailed ways by which things come to be. Right? So all of this comes under the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, it's another way of saying that the various ways and means that we find in the creation on account of which things come to be or arise, then all of that comes under the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing that comes under this is the actual attributes of things and how they will be, and the instincts and the impulses of all things and the attributes of all things, like, the colors of things and the hotness and the coldness of things, and likewise all of the particular details to do with life, or even those things which do not have life, like inanimate things, like we have tables and chairs that don't have life. That all of the particular details of how they will be and their states and their conditions and so on and so forth, that this also comes under the qadr or the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third thing which comes under the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the actual destination of those who are obliged to obey Allah and His messengers, whether they will be happy and pleased or whether they will be wretched, meaning that will they end up in the fire or will they end up in paradise, and will they receive guidance or will they be upon misguidance. So Allah has also included that within the taqdeer. This is within the taqdeer of all things, and so Allah has also determined that as well. And we looked at a passage in the Quran at the beginning of Surah Al-A'la, and we said that the first 3 verses of Surah Al-A'la incorporate these 3 aspects that come under the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you remember, we said Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la, glorified be your Lord, or glorified be the name of your Lord the Most High, alladhi khalaqa fasawwa. Right? So alladhi khalaqa fasawwa walladhi qaddara. Right? This part so far incorporates the first 2 parts that I mentioned, that the one who created and then who fashioned and formed and then who determined. Right? So all of this is the first 2 of the 3 aspects that we mentioned. And then when he said fahada, then he guided. This guidance being mentioned here is the guidance which refers to the guidance that he gave to whole of mankind, either to one path or to the other path, right? Either to the path of happiness or to the path of wretchedness. And it also refers to the instincts that he put within the people, the characteristics and so on and so forth. So anyway, this is what we mentioned. This is where we got in the last lesson. And we said that once these 3 affairs which come under at-taqdeer, that these 3 affairs come under the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that once we've established this, there are now a number of issues that we need to discuss. Right? There are a number of issues now that arise from this that we need to discuss. And then we started discussing these particular issues. And so the first issue that we started in the last lesson, and which we got to, was what is the meaning of al-qadr, what is the meaning of al-qadr in the language, and what is the meaning of al-qadr in terms of the sharia. And so we briefly explained that al-qadr in the language, it basically means that to give something a form or to prepare something in a manner or in a way for which it is befitting and appropriate. Right? And the best example to explain the meaning is a verse in the Quran, and that verse is in Surah Al-Fussilat at the beginning, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the earth, how Allah decreed within the earth its aqwat. Aqwat meaning that those things by which sustenance will arise and be produced. So Allah produced and put all of that within the earth in 4 days. Right? So this now is a taqdeer by Allah, that He is giving something form and a certain constitution and a form for what is appropriate and befitting. In other words, that it will be appropriate and befitting for mankind to acquire their sustenance from that which Allah has, decreed and put within the earth. And so this is the linguistic meaning of al-qadr, as we said, and to give something a form or a shape, or to determine the nature of something, right, such that it is becomes befitting for the thing for which it is being determined. So anyway, this was the linguistic meaning. And as for the Sharia meaning of al-qadr, as we explained, that linguistic meanings are not the same as Sharia meanings, because the Sharia meanings are very specific and they go above and beyond the mere linguistic definitions. So from a Sharia point of view, when we say al-qadr, then this requires that we believe in 4 things. When we speak of al-qadr in the Sharia, then it is 4 things. The first of them is that we believe that Allah has prior knowledge of every single thing. Allah has knowledge of every single thing, of all things. Nothing escapes His knowledge, and it is prior knowledge before they actually occur and take place. The second thing is that Allah wrote the writing of all of that knowledge in the preserved tablet, al-Lawhul Mahfuz. Everything is written in the preserved tablet, and this is before it is created and brought into existence. And the third thing is that Allah's mashi'ah, which is Allah's will, Allah's all-encompassing will, that it encompasses every single thing. Nothing is outside of His will, and nothing occurs except after His will, except because He has willed it to occur. And fourthly, that Allah brings into existence those things which He knows and which have been written and which He has willed. So He actually brings them into existence by creating them and making them occur and bringing them into existence. And so this is the fourth level, al-khalq, which is creation. So the first one is al-ilm, the second one knowledge, the second one is al-kitaba, which is the writing, the third one is al-mashi'ah, Allah's will, and the fourth one is al-khalq, which is the creation. And so all of these, we mentioned them just here briefly, but they will be discussed in more detail a bit later on, along with the proofs from the Quran. But here we are just making some brief points, some brief issues to do with al-qadr. So that's where we finished in the last lesson, and so we're going to continue now. Today's lesson begins from this point now. And so the second issue that we want to discuss then in relation to al-qadr and what we've said already of the 3 points that come under al-qadr is that basically when we come to discuss al-qadr, we have to be cautious and make sure that any discussion and anything that we say or speak about al-qadr, that it must be based upon the texts, right? Because this is an area in which groups went astray in the past, and in particular because the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said in the hadith, إِذَا ذُكِرَ الْقَدْرُ فَأَمْسِكُوا. So he said that when al-qadr is mentioned, then you should remain silent. You should remain silent. And what this means, this does not mean do not speak about al-qadr at all, because obviously we have to speak about al-qadr to the extent that we can understand it in accordance with the book and the sunnah. But what this means, what this statement means, is that you should refrain from speaking about anything or from disputing about anything with respect to al-qadr which is not indicated by the speech of Allah and His Messenger. This is what is meant by this prohibition of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So anything that we do not find in the speech of Allah, speech of the Messenger, then it is not allowed for us to delve into that as it relates to the issue of al-qadr. But as for what is found in the book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Messenger, then from the angle of understanding al-qadr, then as long as we remain within that context and that scope, then it is fine for us to speak and to understand. And the problem arises when we see that a person, when he begins to try to understand things with his intellect and with his reason. And so when a person starts to use his intellect and reason to try to fathom this issue of al-qadr, Allah's decree and Allah's determination of all things, then this is when a person begins to go beyond the texts, and this is where the misguidance begins to appear. And this is actually what happened with the Qadariyah, as we shall see inshallah ta'ala, that the reason why they became misguided is because they failed to grasp or failed to understand, or they relied upon their intellects in trying to understand certain affairs related to al-Qadr. And so what were these affairs that they delved into? So the Shaykh now explains here the primary issue or topic or subject which led these people, all of these people, to err and to become misguided in the field of al-Qadr. And it is the subject, or in fact there are a number of things. The first of them, in fact there are 2 or 3 things, but the first of those reasons, major reasons that led them, the first of those major reasons which led them to err and to fall into a mistake, is that they began to dispute and delve into the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the issue of, are there reasons behind Allah's actions? This is what we call at-Ta'leel. At-Ta'leel. At-Ta'leel means what is the justification and the reason. This is the meaning of at-Ta'leel. At-Ta'leel. And so what these people began to do is that when they try to understand Allah's actions, and they try to look at the issue of, are there reasons behind Allah's actions? Are there reasons behind Allah's actions? Why did Allah do such and such? And why? This is one of the areas where they began to speak about it without knowledge and without understanding. And we see that Allah's actions are from His attributes. Allah's actions are from His attributes, and they are tied to certain reasons which are in agreement with the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in other words, what we are saying is that there are wisdoms behind Allah's actions. There is hikmah, and there is wisdom, or there is hikam, there are wisdoms behind Allah's actions. And when a person tries to understand this subject, right, in other words, he tries to understand and try to explain and try to fathom, Allah's actions in creating what He creates and does what He does, and so on and so forth, then a person is limited by his own perception. He can only grasp from that what he is seeing and observing within the creation. And then from that, he may try to give an explanation and say, well, this is because of that, and this is because of that, and this is because of that. And in this, he, if he's speaking outside of the book and the Sunnah, then he will fall into mistakes. He will fall into errors when he tries to explain the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the wisdoms behind, or the absence or the presence of wisdom and purpose behind the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one of the main areas that we said where, because of it, the people erred on the subject of al-Qadr, because they began to dispute in this issue without any knowledge. And what we are speaking of here, when we speak of what at-Ta'leel, which is the reason or justification, we are speaking here of what we call al-Ilal. Al-Ilal is the plural of illah, which simply means the cause or reason, right? And we are speaking, and basically when we speak of this, what we mean by this is that Allah's actions, we don't dispute that there are reasons and wisdoms behind them. Right? So for example, is there a reason and wisdom behind Allah creating the creation? Is there? And has Allah explained that? And the answer is yes. He created the creation in order to worship Him, the jinn and men to worship Him. So is there now a wisdom behind this action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And we say yes, as Ahlul Sunnah, we say yes, because in the Quran it is clearly established that there is wisdom and reason and purpose behind an objective, behind the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So pay attention to this. And so we believe that the actions of Allah are mu'allala, which means that there is reason behind them. That there's reason behind them. And when we look at this issue, we can look at it from 2 points of view. That in terms of what Allah creates, just the mere creation, is there reason? Are there ilal behind what Allah creates? Are there reasons and justifications behind what Allah creates? Like, for example, we might say, is there a reason and purpose behind the creation of water? Is there a reason and purpose behind the creation of fire? Is there a reason and purpose behind the creation of animals? Okay, and we say yes. Yeah, yes, because within the grand scheme of things, within the scheme of Allah's creations, everything Allah creates it fits into a particular scheme of things. It has a reason and a purpose. And we affirm that Allah indeed created it for a purpose. And Allah's action of creating it, that behind it is a reason and purpose. So we can say, for example, that yes, water has many reasons and it has many purposes, like quenching the thirst of mankind, and whatever else we can say about that. Likewise fire, likewise food, likewise, so this is what we call al-ilal kawniyah. With these things which refer just purely to the created things, that there are reasons behind them. And likewise there are ilal, or reasons and justifications, as it relates to the Sharia as well. As it relates to the Sharia as well. So all of the Sharia rulings that we find in the Sharia, we ask the question, are there reasons behind them? Are they the ahkam of the Sharia? And the answer to that overwhelmingly, most of the rulings of the Sharia, that yes, they have particular reasons behind them, that we can take, even though we might not know it, and even though it might not be explained necessarily in the book or the sunnah, but when we look at the rulings, the ahkam, then overwhelmingly they actually do have a reason behind them. To give you an example, when we look at the example of the prescribed punishments for example, a thief or someone who falsely accuses pious, chaste women of things they are innocent of, and there are certain prescribed punishments, is there a reason behind them? Is there a purpose behind it? Is there a wisdom behind it? Of course there is. Of course there is. And we can apply this to all the different aspects of the Sharia, even the affairs of worship, ad-du'a, as-salah, the prayer, is the hajj, and all the different details. Can we say that there is an illah, there is a reason and a justification behind that? And the answer is yes. Or even though in many cases we might not necessarily know exactly what that is, but we do affirm nevertheless that in general and overwhelmingly that all of the ahkam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there are reasons and justifications behind that. So again, so this is the first thing. And what we mean by people falling into mistakes in these issues is when people start asking the question, okay, why has Allah made someone to be poor and someone to be rich? Alright, so now you start asking this question, try to understand with your aql. Why is so-and-so rich and why is so-and-so poor? Right? Or why has this thing been created like this and that thing been created like that? Or why, for example, why is man like the way man is and why is a woman like the way a woman is? Why? Or why has Allah legislated this and why didn't He legislate this? Right? So you can see what's going on here. Why did He make the earth like this? Or why did He make paradise like that? And why did He make? So you can see all these questions that a person now is starting to ask, and is now trying to understand what is the reason and the purpose and the wisdom behind the way things are, right? And he's trying to grasp and fathom this issue by his intellect, or he's trying to ask questions or raise doubts about why is this like this and why is like that, and then trying to bring answers for that. Do you understand? So here now, when a person starts to enter into this issue of the ta'leel, the reason and the justification behind things, right? Within, as we said, as it relates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His actions, then this now opens up the door for misguidance in the issue of al-Qadr. This is how it actually began. This is the foundation of this whole issue. And so anyway, this is the first major thing. And in this regard, we see that all of the groups who went astray, this is what they began to dispute about, that Allah's will and Allah's wish and the reason, the ta'lilat, the reasons and the purposes and the justifications behind things and the wisdoms behind things. And so this is when they went astray, and for that reason we see in a piece of poetry, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he said in a book of his that relates specifically to al-Qadr, he said, وَأَصْلُ ضَلَالِ الْخَلْقِ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ هُوَ الْخَوْضُ فِي فِعْلِ الْإِلَهِ بِعِلَّةٍ فَإِنَّهُمْ لَمْ يَفْهَمُوا حِكْمَةً لَهُ فَصَارُوا عَلَى نَوْعٍ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ. Which means that the origin of the misguidance of the creation from every group is disputing about the action of Allah as it relates to the reason and the cause and the justification behind it. For indeed they never understood there to be any wisdom in that. So therefore they became and they fell into a type of jahiliyyah. In other words, these people, they denied that there is wisdom and a reason and a justification behind Allah's actions. Right? They denied that. Right? Whereas we believe that yes, behind that, when Allah legislates something, does He legislate for a reason? We say yes. Now, when we say Allah creates a specific thing, do we say that He created for a particular reason, goal, objective and purpose and wisdom? We say yes. Like examples we gave, water, fire and so on and so forth. Whereas these people who went astray in al-Qadr, then they denied that. They denied that there is ta'leel behind the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyway, so this is the first major issue that contributed to, or that opened the door to misguidance. The second issue is that what these people began to do is that when they began to look in the creation and they saw how mankind begins to, how a mankind behaves and operates, and then what they try to do, they try to analogize between that. They try to make an analogy between what they see in the creation, and then they try to impose that upon the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So they looked at men, and they looked at, the actions of men, and they looked at what is wisdom in the actions of men, and what is, right and what is wrong, and so on and so forth. And then, what is justice and what is oppression, and so on and so forth. And then they looked at all of this, and then they tried to make an analogy through this, that this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ought to be. And this is how Allah's actions ought to be. And this is how Allah's legislation ought to be. Right? So they made an analogy between what they saw in the creation, and then try to treat, make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be bound by the same type of restrictions. And to give a number of examples, there are three areas where they erred, and one of them is what we call, I don't want to get into too much of the technical details, but I'll mention them very, very briefly. The first issue is at-Tahseen wat-Taqbih. At-Tahseen wat-Taqbih. This refers to how do we know that something is good and wholesome, and how do we know that something is repugnant and evil and bad, right? So the Mu'tazila said that this is known through the intellect, that the intellect decides and judges what is right and what is, what is wrong, and that the Sharia has, that the Sharia does not have any role at all, right? And so with respect to this issue, they said that whatever, in other words, what they said, that as it relates to Allah's actions, our minds will tell us whether Allah's action is hasan, good, or qabih, or wrong, or evil. So they basically, from this angle, they then, when they began to determine what is hasan, what is good, and what is qabih, meaning evil and bad as it relates to Allah's actions, they try to see that through what they see of mankind. Right? They made an analogy between what they see between mankind, and from this they began to determine that, should Allah be doing this and should Allah not be doing that, and is this binding upon Allah and is this not binding upon Allah? Right? In other words, now they began to decide what is justice as it relates to Allah's actions and what is injustice as it relates to actions. And is there a thing that Allah must do? Right? Is there something that He must do by necessity? Right? So in other words, you can see how basically what they've done is that by making this analogy from what they see amongst mankind, they've now opened up the door, began to speak about Allah and His actions, and what is hasan, good, and what is evil, qabih in the Sharia, and whether Allah is obliged and obligated to do something, or whether He is not obligated to do something. Right? All these issues on whether something can be said to be oppression, or whether something can be said to be justice. Can you see how all these issues now, in all these issues, right, we can see that there will be misguidance, because now they are using a criterion and imposing upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that which they have analogized from the creation. Right? And so this was a second major reason why there was misguidance in the issue of al-qadr. Right? So the first one is, remember, the issue of, is there wisdom, is there hikmah behind the actions of Allah? That's the first one. The second one is that they began to make an analogy from what they saw amongst mankind and creation and their actions, and then they imposed that upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as a result erred in a number of different affairs. And the answer to this second one is basically that there is nothing like unto Allah, as we say the same thing with respect to Allah's attributes, that there is no likeness unto Allah, and He is all hearing, all seeing. So just like we cannot analogize for Allah's attributes with the attributes of the creation, likewise we cannot analogize for Allah's actions and the reasons and the purposes and the wisdoms behind Allah's actions in the manner that we try to explain what happens in the creation. Right? So we can't make analogies in respect to this. And this is the same, we have the same principle that we apply to the issue of Allah's names and attributes. Mankind has attributes, Allah has attributes. Is there an analogy between the two? No, we don't make any analogies. Likewise, mankind has actions, he does certain actions, he has reasons, goals, objectives, motives behind his actions, purposes, wisdoms behind his actions. But does that operate in the same way as Allah's actions? And the answer is no. There's no likeness between the actions of man and the actions of Allah, and the wisdoms and the reasons behind the actions of man and the wisdoms and reasons behind the action of Allah. We don't make any likeness. But they analogized here, and they made mistakes and they went astray. And the third issue that we need to be careful of, the third issue that we need to bear in mind with respect to understanding how mistakes are made in the issue of al-qadr, is that there were many of the scholars of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, they spoke on the issues of al-qadr, and from the early scholars like Ibn Abi Dawood and Ibn al-Mubarak and others, and they also had books which they wrote, and likewise the scholars who came afterwards, they also had books and they wrote as well. And a thing that should be pointed out is that some of the scholars, in the course of refuting the doubts of the Qadariyah, then they brought certain things in, certain rational things into the discussion, which itself has no evidence from the Quran and from the Sunnah. Okay? Now, because these were prominent scholars from Ahlul Sunnah, right? Some people might have taken their statements, and because these were known to be good scholars of Ahlul Sunnah, they wrongly assumed that this issue itself is from the subject of al-qadr when it isn't. Do you understand? Right? So this is like a third area and a third reason through which a mistake can be made, in the sense that some of the scholars, that maybe they spoke about an issue or they delved into an issue in the subject of al-qadr, in the course of refuting or clarifying, and that issue in and of itself does not have any foundation from the speech of Allah and His Messenger. But because he is a known scholar of Ahlul Sunnah, then other people wrongly assumed that this issue is a correct and valid issue, and so they began adopting it and speaking about it. And so this is a third aspect and a third element through which mistakes are made and entered on the subject of al-Qada wal-Qadr. Okay, so in other words, we have to be very, very cautious, very, very clear that when we speak about al-Qadr, that we stick only to the speech of Allah and His Messenger. And these three things that we've mentioned are three of the ways in which mistakes can be fallen into. And historically, this is how mistakes have been fallen into. And so, as we said, just to reiterate once again, the first one is looking at the actions of Allah, the wisdom and the purpose, and asking questions and raising questions about that. And the second one is trying to analogize between the actions of mankind and the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and trying to make parallels between them. And the third one here is following some of the issues that were entered into the discussion of al-Qadr by some of the scholars who wrote on the subject of al-Qadr, but without that really having any proof. So that's an area that we have to be careful of as well. And so this is the second issue then. This is the second issue. The first mas'ala was, what is the definition of al-Qadr? Linguistically and in the Sharia. Second issue is being cautious about speaking about al-Qadr and being aware of these three areas. The third issue we come to now is, what are the various groups and the sects which emerged and went astray on the subject of al-Qadr? And the answer to that, and this is the third issue that we're discussing, which is that basically we have three categories. The first of them are those which we call al-Qadariyah, and the second of them are what we call al-Jabariyah, and the third of them is Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. But as for, obviously, Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah are only one group, because they are united in their creed. But as for the Qadariyah and the Jabariyah, then amongst them there are factions. So we will further subdivide the first two groups into further groups. So the first of them, al-Qadariyah. When we look at the Qadariyah, we see that amongst them are those who are the extremists. Amongst them are those who are moderate, and amongst them are those who have like a light form of not so extreme type of al-Qadr. So who are they? First of all, the extremists from the Qadariyah. And the Qadariyah are the ones who deny al-Qadr. And so the extremists amongst them are those who deny Allah's prior knowledge. So they deny that Allah has prior knowledge of events. And obviously this contradicts our belief, because we believe Allah's knowledge encompasses every single thing, and He knows every single thing before it even occurs, and before He brings it into creation. So His knowledge is all inclusive, and it encompasses every single thing. Nothing escapes His knowledge. But this group of the Qadariyah, the extremists, then they denied Allah's prior knowledge of events, and they are the extremists. And amongst them are then who affirmed Allah's prior knowledge, but they denied His will. And that they denied that His will, His Mashi'a, is operative in the creation. In the sense that the actions of mankind occur by His will. Right? So they denied Allah's will is operative as it relates to the actions of men. Right? So either they denied this, or they denied that Allah creates the actions of the servants. That Allah Himself, that when the actions when the servants act, that it is Allah who creates their actions. So again, they denied either His will or they denied His creative, His khalq. And again, the reason for this is because they did not grasp and understand the subject of al-adl, of justice, because they felt that that a man cannot be responsible for his actions if Allah was willing and creating those actions for him. You understand? And so they became misguided in this issue, and so they began to make man the chooser and the creator of his own actions independently from Allah's will and from Allah's creative power. Right? For that reason, and in this they are mistaken and in error. But these people are what we call, they are not the extremist amongst the Qadariyah, but they are the in between, the middle, the Qadariyah. And so this is the groups of the Qadariyah. There are those who negated knowledge, there are those who negated Allah's will, and there are those who negated Allah's creative power. And as for the Jabariyah, then they are the ones who say that a servant is forced and compelled into his actions. He's forced and compelled. And again, amongst them are the extremists. And from those extremists amongst the Jabariyah are the Jahmiyyah and the extremist Sufis. The Jahmiyyah and the extremist Sufis. Because they basically held the view that a man is basically like you have a plant in the wind, or like you have a string that's tied to a tree or a piece of leather, and it just gets blown by the wind. It doesn't have any will or choice of its own. It just gets tossed in whatever direction, and it has no independent choice of its own. And so this is how they treated man. That man is just simply someone who is forced and compelled into his actions. And so this is the extremist view amongst the Jabariyah. And amongst them are those who are intermediate. And these people, they basically said that a mankind is compelled and forced inwardly. So inwardly, in his batin, inwardly, he is forced and compelled. But outwardly, he has the choice. Now this obviously seems like a very contradictory type of stance. And this view is taken by the Maturidiyya and the Ash'ariyya. And in reality, upon investigation, we find that they are no different in reality to denying choice and will from mankind altogether. Really, it is jabr. It is the same as saying that mankind is completely forced and compelled in his actions. But what they try to do is try to find a middle ground, just by playing with words and playing with definitions, like al-kasb. Al-kasb, they invented this term to mean that mankind, he earns his actions. They try to play around with terms and definitions and say that man is just simply like a repository where actions are performed. And actions are performed not by his choice, although he himself earns them and they are credited to him, whether they are evil or whether they are good. Right? So they try to play about like this and try to find a middle ground, but really they weren't really escaping from the views of the Jabariyah. But anyway, the point being here in brief, that these are the two groups amongst the Jabariyah. We have those who are the extremists and those who are try to take a moderate path. And they are the Ash'aris and Maturidis. And so these are the various groups and the various sects. And what the Shaykh here is not going to delve deeply into the issue of al-Qadr, because as we mentioned in a previous lesson, at-Tahaawee has mentioned al-Qadr in a number of places in his book. He didn't discuss al-Qadr just in one place. He mentioned it in a number of places. And so therefore the detailed discussion about al-Qadr will be left in a later passage, where later on at-Tahaawee deals with it again in a bit more detail. So that discussion will be left for that point. So this now brings us to the third statement that we were discussing, which we started in our previous lesson. And this third statement is وَضَرَبَ لَهُمْ آجَالًا. وَضَرَبَ لَهُمْ آجَالًا, that Allah decreed for them or set for them an appointed fixed time. An appointed fixed time, meaning for mankind, that He appointed for them an appointed fixed time. Ajal. And so inshallah now we will discuss this particular statement. So the word ajal is the plural of ajal, and ajal literally means an appointed, fixed, determined time. An appointed, fixed, determined time. And so we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the statement that at-Tahaawee is mentioned, وَضَرَبَ لَهُمْ آجَالًا, that for every single thing Allah has made an appointed, fixed duration or a period or a time. And what it means is that the heavens and the earth have an appointed, fixed time at which they will come to an end. Right? And the same for every single thing in the creation. Allah has made for every single thing an ajal. And there are some things which only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows when their ajal is, when their appointed fixed time is. And none of the servants know that. And there are other things which never have, which do not have any end at all. Well, like for example, paradise does not have any end at all because it is eternal. Allah created it to be eternal. But there are other things which have an ajal, have an appointed fixed time. So now one thing that we should be clear about here is the difference between the word ajal and between the word a'mar. Because there is ajal and there is umr. Right? Ajal, which we mean by an appointed fixed time, and umr means a lifespan of an individual. And there is a difference between these two words, and we should not confuse between these two words. And this is what we will explain next. Basically, when we see in the Quran, we find that Allah has distinguished between these two things in the Quran. And the proof for that is that when Allah spoke of an ajal meaning the appointed fixed time at which the end of something has come. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, فَإِذَا جَاءَ أَجَلُهُمْ لَا يَسْتَأْخِرُونَ سَاعَةً وَلَا يَسْتَقْدِمُونَ. Allah says in Surah Yunus, Surah 10, verse 49, that when their ajal, meaning when their appointed fixed time comes, they will not be able to delay it even for an hour, and nor will they be able to bring it forward. And likewise Allah says in Surah Yunus, again the same verse, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ أَجَلٍ, that every single nation has an appointed fixed time. Meaning that every nation, that an appointed fixed time at which it will come to an end and perish. And so again, we see that here, that the ajal, the appointed fixed time, is something that can never ever be moved forward, nor can it be moved backward. It never ever changes. But as for the umr, which is again like a lifespan, or the duration of a lifespan, then with respect to that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said in Surah Fatir, Surah 35, verse 11, وَمَا يُعَمَّرُ مِن مُعَمَّرٍ وَلَا يُنْقَصُ مِنْ عُمُرِهِ إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ. That no one is given an increase in life, an increase in life or a decrease in his life, except that it is written in a book. Except it is written in a book. So we see here that that which is the umr, meaning the actual lifespan or the duration of the lifespan, Allah has spoken here of there being an increase and a decrease. But as for the ajal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He denied that there can be any moving ahead or bringing back an ajal, right? So we need to distinguish between these two things. So how do we reconcile these two things? How do we bring these two things together? Because it appears to be a conflict here. And the answer is that the ajal, as we said, it's clear in these verses that which is the ajal, meaning that the appointed fixed time for something, that this will never ever change. It is from Allah's prior knowledge, and it is written in the Lawhul Mahfuz, and this will never ever change. Right? It will never ever change. But as for the a'mar, meaning the durations and the lifespans of things, then they can admit to an increase or a decrease. And this is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made reasons and causes behind that and for that in His creation. And all of that is included within His qadr. And so we see a proof for this in the Quran is the verse in Surah Ar-Ra'd, Surah 13, verse 39, when Allah says, يَمْحُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيُثْبِتُ وَعِنْدَهُ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ. That Allah, He erases and removes whatever He wishes, whatever He wills, and He corroborates and affirms what He wishes. And with Him is the mother of the book. Now what this verse means, we shall explain inshallah now, because this verse helps us to understand the difference between ajal and between umar, right? Between the appointed fixed time and between the duration of the lifespan. And so what this means is that the ajal, that the appointed fixed time, is whatever is written in the Lawhul Mahfuz about any particular nation, or the ending of a life of somebody, and basically whatever is in Allah's knowledge of the appointed fixed times for every single thing for it to occur, and when it will occur at its appointed fixed time. So nothing will ever change, right? So in Allah's knowledge that a particular leaf will fall at a particular time, that is its ajal, right? It will never ever change, because nothing in the Lawhul Mahfuz is subject to change. In the preserved tablet, nothing is subject to change. Why? Because it is from Allah's knowledge. And nothing in Allah's knowledge, Allah's knowledge is complete and perfect, and nothing, is subject to, is omitted from Allah's knowledge. And so, but we make a distinction between that and between some of the other types of taqdeer. Because this taqdeer is the foundational taqdeer for every single thing. That meaning that which is in Allah's knowledge, that which is written down. And this is what is referred to in the statement of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah decreed the decrees of all of creation before He created the heavens and the earth by 50,000 years. Right, so that taqdeer is the overall, all-encompassing, foundational taqdeer for every single thing. It never ever changes. It is never ever subject to change. And this is the taqdeerul aam, the general taqdeer, and this is what is in the Lawhul Mahfuz. However, there is other types of taqdeer which we call the taqdeer khas, the specific type of taqdeer. And this type of taqdeer, there are it varies. So from it is, for example, the taqdeer that takes place in the womb when a person is in the womb of his mother, then at that stage there is a taqdeer which the angels write down. That's in the scrolls of the angels, right? And likewise there is the taqdeer, the yearly taqdeer, which takes place on Laylatul Qadr. So the taqdeer is written, right, for the following year. That's another type of taqdeer which is khas. And likewise there is the taqdeer which is yawmi, which is the daily taqdeer, right? Now, all of these taqdeer, there's different types of taqdeer, but the taqdeer which is subject to change, which can be changed, right, is what is written in the scrolls of the angels. Right? Meaning that when the angels are ordered to write down in the womb of an individual, that what will be, the four things that I mentioned, not the four things, but from the things which he is ordered to write is like his lifespan, right? And so that is subject to change. And so this is what is being referred to in the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He said that no one is given an increase, وَمَا يُعَمَّرُ مِن مُعَمَّرٍ وَلَا يُنْقَصُ مِنْ عُمُرِهِ إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ. That no one is given an increase in his life or a decrease in his life except that it is in a book. Right? So what this is referring to is that even though what the angels write down as part of the taqdeer of that individual, it might be a certain thing, right? So it might not be actually the actual thing that happens, because the actual thing that happens, it is in the Lawhul Mahfuz. So any increase in that person's lifespan from what is written in the scrolls of the angels, or any decrease in the lifespan of that person from what is written in the angels, that itself is written in the Lawhul Mahfuz. And this is what this verse is referring to. This proves that a person's lifespan can be subject to increase and decrease from what is written in the scrolls of the angels. And for this there are certain ways and means and asbab that Allah has put in the creation to allow for that increase and decrease. Right? And this we know from other statements in the Sunnah. Like Allah's Messenger, he said, whoever is pleased that his sustenance should be increased, that his rizq should be increased, or that his lifespan should be increased and left longer, then let him tie the ties of kinship. Let him keep the ties of kinship. And let him maintain his family relations. And likewise, in another hadith, the Messenger said, وَلَا يَزِيدُ الْعُمْرِ إِلَّا الْبِرِّ, that nothing increases the lifespan except for righteousness. So this proves that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed asbab, meaning ways and means and things by which if a person was to implement them, then there will be an increase in his lifespan, an increase above and beyond what is written in the scrolls of the angels. But as for what is written in the Lawhul Mahfuz, then obviously that can never ever change. Right? And as for any increase and decrease that is decreed to occur in his lifespan, that also is in the Lawhul Mahfuz. Right? You understand? Right? So in the angel scrolls, it might say that a person's life, his ajal, his life is such and such. Not his ajal, but his umr is such and such. Right? Yet in the Lawhul Mahfuz, it may be there that his lifespan will increase by such and such amount. Right? So that increase is itself written in the Lawhul Mahfuz, and the Lawhul Mahfuz is the absolute knowledge and information of every single thing to occur in all its detail. Right? So this is how we reconcile between the verses that speak of the ajal, the prescribed appointed time. So when your time comes to die, as it relates to the Lawhul Mahfuz, that will never move forward, nor will it move back. You will die at that particular point in time, exactly as it is known in Allah's knowledge and written in the Lawhul Mahfuz. That will never ever change. That will never ever change. But as for your lifespan, that it may have increased and it may have decreased from what is in the scrolls of the angels, right? So therefore we don't see any contradiction between any of these statements in the Quran and in the Sunnah. All of them, we can see now that they are in complete conformity with each other. Right? The fact that everything has an appointed ajal, the fact that the umr of an individual, the duration of a lifespan can increase and decrease, and that there are asbab, ways and means that Allah has placed that will lead to an increase in a person. All of this we can reconcile, and we can also therefore understand the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يَمْحُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيُثْبِتُ وَعِنْدَهُ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ. So when Allah says that Allah erases whatever He wills and affirms what He wills, this is now speaking about what is in the scrolls of the angels. Right? So what is written in the scrolls of the angels, either Allah will erase or affirm and corroborate that, yes, that indeed is how it will be. وَعِنْدَهُ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ. Yet with Him is the mother of the book. Meaning that with Him is the Lawhul Mahfuz, and that never ever ever changes. That is established. That will never ever change. Right? So this is how we understand all of these different texts, and this now brings us to, in fact, what we'll do, because we've come to the end of the time, we'll conclude here, inshallah ta'ala. And so we'll leave the discussion here. So inshallah, we'll conclude the discussion there. If anybody has any questions about what's been said in this lesson, if anything's not clear, then we have a short time for that. Otherwise, we will conclude here, inshallah. Okay, if there are no questions, then we will conclude the lesson here today. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت وأستغفرك وأتوب إليك. And as for the lesson next week, I'm not sure about whether that will take place. So if you just keep a check on your email, or I'm sure there will be a reminder notice sent out if there will be a lesson. So there may be a lesson next week, and in 2 weeks' time there will not be a lesson. So in 2 weeks there won't be a lesson. Next week there may be a lesson. But just again check the website and the email. But after that, inshallah, we will continue. Hopefully, it's Ramadan. So in Ramadan, we may probably just have general lessons. So we'll discontinue the lessons on this book up until after Ramadan, inshallah ta'ala. But in Ramadan, we may have just some general lessons to do with Ramadan and things of that nature. So, so just please bear that in mind, inshallah.